What do these two films have in common? Well, it's very, very interesting. Man of Steel starts in year one of Superman being Superman. Superman Begins, if you like. Now, the Batman, basically, that's right, that's the one. Yeah, the Batman starts in year two. Now, that's something it has in common with Superman Legacy. We'll get into the rights and wrongs of that very shortly. But both these films do a similar thing. You barely see Robert Pattinson dressed as Bruce Wayne in that movie. He's mainly Batman. And in Man of Steel, for most of the movie, Henry Cavill is mainly dressed in the Superman costume, skipping the alter ego. And I think that's a very, very interesting thing for a first movie. Will we see more of Bruce Wayne in the Batman 2, or will it be mostly Batman? Again, I wouldn't hold my breath of saying, Bruce Wayne the Playboy, because basically Matt Reeves is very current year politics, and he doesn't want to represent Bruce Wayne as the playboy who sleeps with women and drinks and parties, so nobody suspects that he's Batman. So I wouldn't expect that. But it takes me to the point I want to make. James Gunn is skipping year one of Superman's story in Superman Legacy. That means not only does he skip the Krypton origin story, that we won't see Jor-El and Lara putting Superman yet again in the pod and sending him off. We won't see that. And what happens basically is when you skip year one, you don't just skip the Kryptonian origin story. You skip Clark and Lois' first meeting. Their romance developing. By starting in year two, James Gunn could already have Clark and Lois as a couple already. She could already know that he's Superman. So you skip all this character development and it's just there. I'm not saying that's what he's going to do, but that could be his motivation of starting in year two. Not just to skip the origin story, but to skip the stuff he's not very good at doing. Do you understand? So that could be a thing as well. Because there's been this desperate attempt for years by people in comics and in live action, film and television to make Superman relevant. There's a lot of people who write Superman in the comics who believe he's near impossible to write because he's a Boy Scout, because he's got all these powers. I don't agree. All it takes is a good imagination and writing nuance to write any character. Superman isn't difficult to write because he's indestructible. Smallville found the best way to find Superman's weakness. They really did great stuff with kryptonite. They used that to their advantage. But not just that. It was the emotional facet that was Clark's weakness. It was his friendship, his boyhood friendship with Lex Luthor. That was the weakness. This is where you found the humanity in the Superman story. As I say, if you're clever, you can write great Superman. Superman Returns is so obsessed with making Superman relatable in the 21st century that it has this whole thing that he went to find Krypton, the remains of Krypton, was off planet Earth for 5 years, and Lois Lane does this article. The world doesn't need Superman. Why the world doesn't need Superman? Because they're trying to prove the point that Superman is important. And I think what James Gunn is attempting to do, whether he's being lazy and skipping all the origin stuff or not, is saying, right, here's Superman. He's in the costume. He's Superman. There's a Justice League. There's an existing DC universe here. I'm not going to give you the origins of that. It's just here. And I've always said this. Yes, in 78 it was important to do the big origin movie. Man of Steel wanted to do an origin movie in terms of a first contact story, and it works for what they wanted to do. Well, it works for some of the audience, and some of the audience it doesn't work for. But what Gunn's trying to do here is say, I'm not going to try and prove that he's relevant. I'm going to say, here's Superman, here's Clark Kent, Here's Lois Lane, here's Jimmy Olsen, here's Perry White, here's Lex Luthor. They're already in this iconic situation. I'm not going to build the iconic situation. You're not going to watch me build the world from the very beginning. The world is already here. You know, there's Gotham City, there's Batman, there's Bruce Wayne, there's the Bat family. They're already there in this universe. You know, the Green Lantern Corps has already been introduced to the world. It's a living, breathing DC universe. That's what James Gunn's attempting to do. Now, in terms of Superman, this could actually be, in the modern day, a great way to do it. Now, we've had so many discussions about James Gunn and not bringing Cavill back and, you know, all the problematic situations he's been involved with in terms of since he's become co-CEO of DC Studios. But we really haven't spoken enough about his strengths as a writer-director. Clearly, he can write, he can direct. It would be stupid to say that he can't. He can. And that's a facet. I won't start saying things because I love other things. I won't say horrible things about James Gunn just for the heck of it, right? He's a very good writer-director. We say that on this channel every day. Because unfortunately with people these days, you really have to underline that you're not going for someone, you're not criticising someone for the hell of it. I don't take pleasure in criticising James Gunn because I think he's a pretty good writer-director. I love his Guardians movies. I love his other CBM as well, The Suicide Squad. I think it's a great movie, and I love Peacemaker. I say that every day. It's important. It's important to underline things to modern-day kind of internet audiences. So, because the people who are, the people who love Snyder like I do, want to come in here and want me to say how great Snyder is and how bad James Gunn is. But I'm a balanced individual. It's a subjective thing. Now, there are problematic elements with Gunn, but he's clearly got some kind of an idea how he wants to, execute a DC universe and how he wants to execute a Superman movie. And I think a living, breathing, already existing DC universe and Superman universe is probably the best way to go about it. And a film that doesn't try and justify Superman's existence and say, yes, he's relevant. Let's prove to the world he's relevant. Why does Superman have to prove he's relevant? Batman doesn't have to prove he's relevant. Spider-Man doesn't have to prove he's relevant. Supergirl won't have to prove she's relevant. She's a gal, right? So all these different amazing characters, the Green Lantern Corps doesn't have to, doesn't have to, prove its relevance. Why is it it's always Superman that has to prove its relevance? Because Superman's been in the dock for many, many years from a lot of people who don't understand the character. He's too powerful, he's too nice, nobody cares. So Snyder, Goyer and Nolan take Superman and kind of, in a lot of ways, shave off the Boy Scout nature about him in Man of Steel and BVS. He's more of a robust character played by Henry Cavill. He can be a lot more aggressive at times. And he ain't the Christopher Reeve Superman. Christopher Reeve Superman was a very gentle, jovial Superman. But we saw what he does to Steppenwolf in the Snyder Cut. He kicks the living shit out of him, and I'm watching it. And I'm thinking, Jesus Christ, Zach, I think you're taking this a bit too far. Because even though Steppenwolf's a bad guy, he's a bad boy, and he's done bad things, you kind of feel sorry for him by the time Superman's finished with him. And then Wonder Woman, for good measure, chops the geezer's fucking head off. So you're kind of watching it and you're thinking, too far. I mean, it's great to watch. I love Snyder Cut. I love the Snyder Cut. I love the Snyderverse, but I think when I see Henry Cavill's Superman beating the living shit and, burning him with his heat vision, Steppenwolf, I just think maybe it just came across like bullying in the end. And they're the differences. And I think, in the nature, you have to understand you can do Superman more damage when you try and make him more relevant. And I think this is what they tried to do. They tried to take away the pure-hearted nature away from Superman. I think, especially in BVS, and then in the Snyder Cut, in the way he's beating the shit out of Steppenwolf. And I think, in the end, to make Superman relevant, He's got to be there. Superman's just got to be Superman. He's got to be saving people. He's got to be the character he's always been. But I've always said there's nothing wrong with giving him a few quips, and putting personality into his character. And I think this is what James Gunn will kind of attempt with David Corenswet. And I think this is why David's been cast, because, as I said the other day, he's very, very good at dialogue. So you're going to see a very, very different Clark and Superman. And I am excited and intrigued and interested to see what they do with it. Now, today's a big day in Hollywood because the writers and the actors unions are negotiating again. I know I'm asking a lot and I won't hold my breath, but we could be in a situation where these strikes are finally over by Friday. It's very complicated because of the AI, mostly because of streaming payments and things like that. But I do want the strikes to be over. And I want this DC universe to be developed because it's going to happen. Some people come on here and say, Superman Legacy is not going to happen. You may be right, but at the moment it is happening. We can only work off what's going to happen, right? And this is why we're talking about Superman Legacy. So, he wants to skip year one and say, we're already there. I think that's the point. He wants to kind of say, we're there. So he doesn't really want to mess about with developing the Clark and Lois relationship, the origin story on Krypton. But it's pretty clear. There will be a Jor-El and Lara in this universe, either in this movie or down the road. All the things, all the bells and whistles that make Superman Superman, that you and I love, will be there. There's lots of different, when we hear the different arguments between Snyder fans and, hardcore DC and Superman fans, it's interesting. A lot of Snyder fans say to me, well, I wasn't a fan of Superman before I saw Man of Steel. And I've said this before on here, and I'll say it again, I find that very, very interesting. Because in a lot of ways, Snyder, Goyer, and Nolan, chisel away a lot of the things that make Superman traditionally Superman. And that's interesting. Considering there's no Clark Kent in the Daily Planet till the ending of Man of Steel, like we discussed yesterday. He's a bit more of a reactive character, like that moment when he goes, you think you can threaten my mother? It's a brilliant moment. I love it. I'm waving my fist. It's awesome. But it isn't kind of a usual thing you do with Superman. So he's a lot more reactive. At times, he does come across a lot more like Batman rather than Superman. And that's interesting. It's a Superman Begins movie. So he hasn't got the patience yet. He hasn't learned to master all his abilities, and he's fighting a trained Kryptonian general. General Zod was the hero of Krypton. He was the protector. He was the Superman of Krypton. That was his role. And this is why he takes it upon himself to save the Kryptonians and, keep the race going. Because nobody else is around to do it. I mean, maybe if he didn't kill Jor-El the twat, maybe he could have been convinced to do things in a better way. But, yeah, and I think there's different, everyone has different ideas of Superman. I think the thing is, different writers, different directors have a different idea on how to contemporize Superman. So Snyder, Goyer, and Nolan had the idea of saying, right, he's got to be a little bit more human. He's got to have a bit of a temper sometimes. He's got to react, and sometimes he's going to make mistakes, as he did in Smallville, by the way. But he was a teenager then, so it's interesting. There's a lot of interesting, good facets to Man of Steel. The flashback in the tornado sequence when they're in the car, and he goes, our family's been farmers for generations. He goes, why am I having this conversation? Clark says, you're not even my parents. You're not my dad. And that's an adopted parent's worst nightmare. Horrible. Clark didn't mean it. It was a reaction because Clark doesn't want to be a farmer. It's an interesting discussion. So there's really good facets to that movie. But I think, as I say, everyone's got different ideas on, who Clark is and who Superman is. And it's interesting. And I think in a lot of ways, James Gunn won't mess with the basics like Dick Donner didn't mess with the basics. I think that Snyder, Goyer, and Nolan were quite happy to mess with the basics because their opinion was, right, this Superman, this Action Comics #1 Superman, nah. Although in the original comic, Action Comics #1, he was a lot more of a more aggressive character. This is what people forget. He wasn't always as pure-hearted as we saw in Superman 78. It's interesting because in the end, it's not the real, basically, Siegel and Schuster in that first Action Comics had him beating up, mine owners who were abusing their employees, men who were beating up their wives, and he was grabbing hold of them and chucking them down the precinct. So he was much more of a, volatile character that didn't take shit from people who did wrong. You either did right or wrong. It was a bit black and white, but 1938 was not just visually a black and white era, but I think mentality-wise, good and evil was very, very basic and simple. And I think storytellers today try and attempt to tell the complexities of right and wrong. How did you become a villain? General Zod was once a good man, the hero of Krypton. How did he become, the evil dictator he becomes in Man of Steel? Well, it's the same as people from the Middle East who are good family men and women, but end up being, terrorists. How do you go from that to that? Because life and the world and power chisel away the goodness from you. And that's what's happened to General Zod. That's why in the opening of the movie, when he comes in and he kills one of the female Kryptonian council member, and, when he goes, basically, right, I'm taking control, and, she goes, on whose authority? That pisses Zod off. On mine, Booth. And because he's had enough of taking their shit, because of their lack of courage, they've ran Krypton into the ground. So there's a lot of great facets of Man of Steel. Whether it was the right way to bring in a huge general audience to watch a Superman movie, I don't know. But it has big themes, it has big ideas, and it's absolutely stunning to look at. I was watching it yesterday as well. A fabulous movie, it really is. People were saying Superman Returns was too slow, too talky, too romantic, not enough action. Zack Snyder gave us a lot of action, but then people complained, that there was too much destruction and too much action. You can't please these people. In Superman Returns, Kate Bosworth, who played Lois, was too young. In Man of Steel, Amy Adams was too old. So you're never going to please people. Now, I think people will really like Rachel Brosnahan. I really do, as Lois Lane. Lois Lane is really a difficult character to get right. Why? Because you can make her too unlikable if she seems like she's a man-hater and she's bullying Clark with, with the way she is. And I think sometimes some writers may look at Lois and say she's a feminist. She's not really. She's not really even a fan of other women. Lois, from the beginning, has always been a character that just cares about getting her story and her name on the story. But she cares about the world she lives in. And she uses her talents as a journalist to expose people, corrupt people. That's why Lois Lane is a journalist. So she's a very good person and she's a journalist for the right reasons. And she believes in what she's doing. So Lois Lane is a hero. But this facet of, Lois not being able to be a damsel in distress, that she doesn't need saving because she's a gal boss. Let me tell you something. I'm a strong 6-foot geezer. I go to the gym. I'm trained in martial arts. Lots of things, right? But sometimes I need help. Sometimes I need a shoulder to cry on. And I can promise you, if someone pushes me off a fucking building, I'm going to need a superhero to save me. Everybody needs saving, including Lois Lane. So she can be strong. She can be strong. But sometimes she can need saving as well. And sometimes she can save Superman, right? She can be there for Superman. So you've got to ignore the feminists. You've got to ignore the extreme left and just make your movie. And I think this is what James Gunn has been told by David Zaslav. Make a traditional Superman movie that builds up your DC universe. So in a lot of ways, this is very interesting. Look, James Gunn has a big job on his hands. He's got to unite the DC fandom, but it's beyond that. It's not just about the DC fandom. And it's interesting, what is the DC fandom? In a lot of ways, the Snyderverse stands are a new part of the DC fandom. You know, we talk about real DC fans and Snyderverse fans. Well, you know, I've been a DC fan since 1978. You know, when I saw, not since 1978. I never saw Superman the movie in 78. How old was I in 78? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I was 6 years old, right? So, yeah, I don't think I saw it when I was 6 years old. But maybe slightly older, a couple of years later, I think I saw that. And at 8 years old, it was the first film I ever saw. And you're thinking, what, you didn't watch a film till you were 8 years old? Yep. That's right. That's what introduced me into entertainment. Before, we used to play board games. And anyway, I led a sheltered life as a little boy, obviously, before I saw Superman the movie. But I think, you know, it's interesting because when I saw Superman the movie, we lived in more innocent times. And, you know, the modern era will say, well, more problematic times in the way things were represented. But listen, you can't go back and look at the past and say you were wrong. You know, we're more evolved now, right? It's like going back to the cavemen and saying, why did you just bash that woman over their head with your club? They think they're doing the right thing. They don't know. They don't know what they're doing is brutal. That might be insane for you to understand that. But you can't look at the past and judge it on modern day terms like we're doing modern day movies. People, you know, they're talking about doing a Ghost reboot and saying, you know, it was wrong to have a Mexican villain and it was too stereotypical to say a Mexican person was a villain. But at the end of the day, you know, it is what it is. When they made that film, they weren't attempting to stereotype Mexican or Latino people as all criminals. They just made a decision, right? You know, this is what you've got to understand. When, you know, maybe a man's talking over a woman, he doesn't mean to talk over a woman. It's just a habit. I mean, I talk over everyone because I'm loud and I'm passionate. It's annoying, but we all have these annoying traits in our personalities. We can't tell the past that they're doing things wrong because they could say that the past could say to us, well, hang on a minute, what about cancel culture? How can you prejudge Russell Brand without any due process? How can the BBC take down his content? How can his management fire him? I mean, if I was someone from the past looking at cancel culture, I'd be fucking saying, oh my God, that's like an apocalyptic fucking era of humanity. It's terrible. So I think it's very, very interesting that, you know, people do look at Superman 78 with a lot of nostalgia. And at the time when we were watching that movie, we loved it. No one had any complaints. It was perfectly fine. So I think with a Superman movie today, you've got to find the balance of who Superman is, but don't try and justify who he is. I think he's just got to be Superman. He's got to be the nice guy. He's got to have the powers and he's got to save people. He needs a bit of a personality. He needs, he needs to feel like a friend. Christopher Reeve's Superman says he's a friend to Lois Lane. Who are you? A friend. That's how he's got to feel. A friend. And I think if they can do that and make kids look to Superman and say, wow, I like him. Seems like a fun guy to be around. He's a hero. You know, if James Gunn can do that and build this DC universe, then he may be onto something. Look, it's very difficult and challenging for James Gunn because there's a lot of problems at Warner Brothers, and we're in an era of entertainment where there's not much money around, they're desperate, and, you know, they've decided to do a cinematic universe, which I think is a mistake. Maybe Gunn can pull it off, maybe he can't. We'll have to wait and see if it even happens. But I think in terms of his ability as a writer-director, he has got these challenges, especially with Superman, because no one's been able, since Superman 78, to create the big hit that everybody likes. Mainstream DC fans, in a lot of ways, the Snyderverse, Justice League, all of that, it damaged DC. And something has to be able to repair it. Basically, we need to be able to move on from the Snyderverse without going back to it and say, look what they did to Snyder, blah, blah, blah. We've got to be able to move on and say, well, do you know what? Those Snyder movies were great, but now it's time for something new. I think until we can do that, and until they can convince the audience of doing that, we're going to go round the same Groundhog Day all the time. And I think that's the problem. And in a lot of ways, it's why Man of Steel only made $650 million, as well as other reasons, and Superman Returns barely made $400 million. There's reasons for that as well. You need a Superman film that captures the imagination. And by having all these cameos of other DC existing heroes in James Gunn's new DC universe, that's another way of saying to the audience, come on in. There's not just Superman in this movie, but it is his movie. So if James Gunn can pull that off, he hasn't really missed with his CBMs or Peacemaker. He hasn't missed. Now, some people can criticize some of the things he does. They can pause and slow pause the stuff on Twitter. It doesn't matter. Guardians 2, Guardians 3 made money. They were critically acclaimed. The Suicide Squad was critically acclaimed, but didn't make much money. Facts, right? But I still think it's a great movie. And Peacemaker does some amazing things, especially having Peacemaker be this mentally tortured, abused child. His father wants to kill him. But they find a way of showing us that Peacemaker is a victim. So they show us the softer side of him as well as the stupid side of him as well. So it's interesting. James able to give you comedy, but a really tight storyline, interesting dramatic storyline as well. And watching Peacemaker and thinking, this guy can write. This guy is a good director. There's no question about it. I understand to Snyder fans, the only director that exists is Zack Snyder. But as I say, I've been watching entertainment, TV and film since I was 8 years old. I've seen the Superman movies and the 1960s Batman series and Batman movie, which I absolutely adore. Batman 89, Batman 92, Superman Returns, lots of the Ghostbusters, Gremlins, Die Hard. So I'm not a one director person. There's a lot of Snyder fans who have never seen a Star Wars film. There's some Snyder fans, I imagine, that have never watched any film that hasn't got Zack Snyder attached to it. I believe there's a few out there, so it's a bit of an echo chamber. And if you're in that echo chamber, it can be all encompassing. But for the rest of us, we can appreciate Zack Snyder. You don't have to appreciate Zack Snyder. That's something I have to say as well. I do, thankfully. I think he's a great, great visual director and really displays the physicality of a superhero or his characters, which is great. But there are other directors out there, and we can't keep on going around in circles. He made 3 movies that I absolutely adore. They should have allowed him to finish his arc, but they didn't. The reality is they probably won't allow him to finish what he started. And he's on a new journey now with Rebel Moon. And that's okay. At least we got to see the Snyder Cut. And James Gunn has been given the keys to the kingdom. Now, David Zaslav is the CEO of Warner Brothers Discovery. He, from the outside looking in, he's an interesting guy. He's making some interesting decisions. Now, we don't know if his decision making will pay off yet. Most of the Warner Brothers films and TV shows you're seeing now are pre-Zaslav decision making. So we're going to see if his decision making can work. It's going to be very, very interesting. This time next year, will WB be up for sale, or is Zaslav the real deal? And if WB does go up for sale, what happens to the James Gunn plan? Does a new person come in and say, nah, I don't like what you're doing here, James? Because one of the problems is with selling WB again, we're going around this, carousel. Someone buys it, we think, oh yeah, there's going to be the changes that DC needs. We fought this with DC Studios and James Gunn. It's been a bit interesting. We don't know if DC Universe is actually going to work yet. We have to give him a chance. He's made mistakes with these DCEU movies, interfering with them, not doing a clean reboot. I agree with that, and I'm not going to change my mind on that. As I say, I'm a very balanced individual. But nobody can tell you whether DC Universe is going to work or not. But the challenge is bringing audiences back to the cinema to watch DC movies. Why haven't people supported these DCEU movies? Because they don't matter. They don't matter because in the past we just went to see movies. We watched Police Academy without worrying if there was going to be a Police Academy for citizens on patrol down the line, didn't we? But the MCU changed the audience's mentality that movies have to matter, that it's got to be about, something big happening. And I think that's the problem. And so audiences are not motivated to see a dying franchise. And I think this is why these movies are flops. Now we'll see what happens to Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom. I think it'll make more money than all the rest of the remaining DCEU movies. I think it's got a good movie in there, depending on the cut we actually get. But I think just because the DCEU movies are flopping, it doesn't mean that James Gunn's DC universe will also be a failure.